Welcome to the Hazard Class Podcast. This is the podcast where I ask my stupid questions to some of the smartest people in and around the world of emergency response. This week, it's a little bit different. As the host of this podcast, I reserve the right to talk to anyone that I find interesting that knows things about things that I am interested in. With that, my guest this week is one of the world's foremost experts in gladiatorial life, combat, and weaponry. He has a profound knowledge of Roman history and culture. He has worked in the TV and film industry as a historical consultant and technical expert for countless projects. He has dedicated over 20 years to teaching, preserving, and furthering knowledge of ancient Roman history. My pleasure to welcome my guest this week, the Gladiator historian, Alexander Mariotti. Alex, thank you for joining me. I appreciate it.
Jake, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, I'm very much looking forward to picking your brain about this. The Gladiator films are some of my favorite of all time, and just the whole lore and the subject matter is super fascinating. So I can't wait to talk to someone that actually knows the questions I've had for a long time. But before that, we always open the show with our Wheel of Stupid Questions, which is just a reminder that asking questions is good. Even if they're stupid, if you point them at the right people, you can get some pretty smart answers. So we'll bounce right into that. We'll hammer that, and then we'll get into the nuts and bolts of talking gladiators.
Let's go for it.
Spin that wheel of stupid questions.
Okay. We'll spin the wheel and we'll see what we get this week. Oh, this is great. This is a perfect question for you. What is the largest animal you believe you could fight with your bare hands?
What is the largest animal I believe I could fight with my bare hands? Probably a man, but I suppose man is a beast after all. The Greeks and Romans believed it. Gosh, it depends on what period of my life. 20 years ago, I'd probably say any wild cat. But I'll reserve, in true gladiatorial fashion, a rhino at the moment. Go on.
Oh, wow. That's good. I've had a past guest say a tortoise. And I was like, man, you get an underwhelming belief in yourself. A rhino, I like that. You believe in yourself.
Well, I've watched Gladiator 2. I know how to do it now. So
it's that simple, honestly.
You just throw some puff in the air and then you get that out of the way and it'll smash into something. It's super easy.
Easy. Okay, so with that, let's get into the real thing. So you are now one of the, if not the leading expert in gladiators in the world. Why gladiators? How do you get into gladiators?
Oh, yeah. Well, why not gladiators? I think they're the most fascinating characters of ancient history. And I think they're more compelling to us than any other characters. We don't, there's very few people that live in the echelon of the upper class, the way the emperors lived or the generals. But the gladiator is kind of the common man. And he's in a battle which sometimes he's put into and sometimes he puts himself into. And it's a battle that he has to fight to win. And I think it's so compelling a story that it's easy to become obsessed with gladiators. And you see that we are obsessed with them. But partially it's because I was very lucky to have two parents who loved history and because I actually grew up with the Colosseum. So in a weird way, I have a very Roman upbringing in which the Colosseum isn't some weird historical monument that I went to visit at a moment of my life. It's something that's always been there. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, that's what it represents. So I became fascinated with the history at a very early age. And I think I just gravitated towards it. I just love the world of it. The combat, the masculinity of it, the bravery, the pageantry of it. But the more you delve into it, the more you find it's just a truly, truly intricate and fascinating topic.
And so as you kind of went through this process of, really becoming an expert in this field, what did you think was going to become of this interest? Like I can't fathom as a child, you're like, one day I'll work in TV and film, like as a consultant and be on TV talking about gladiators. So was it just kind of a side quest of your life to like learn these things and all of a sudden it became, wow, this is a career, or how did you do that?
It kind of happened really serendipitously. So many things happen that you're just kind of like, it depends what a man believes in. Some believe in destiny, some believe in coincidence. There's certain things that just naturally happened that enabled me to do this work. I was a very physical person. I played, I played American football. I played in college. I played for Scotland, and I loved physical things. And I had friends who worked in the movie business, so I ended up working in the stunt business for a bit. And I saw people like, it kind of appealed to two passions of me. One, it was a very physical job, and it was super cool. Got to be on set, got to do fights, got to get trained up. Got to live these moments. But then on the other side of the coin, I for somebody who was studying history, I was like, this is visually amazing. I'm actually in the battlefields. I'm on the beaches of Troy. I'm in the middle of Caesar's, civil war. It's just, so I was able to, describe it a lot better than I think somebody who just had read about it. But everything kind of progressively happened, but naturally. I would love to say it was a huge plan. I'd like to do an Arnold Schwarzenegger and say that I always had a clear, bold vision. It sounds so great, but that's not true. I've been exceptionally lucky, and because I think, honestly, it's because it's something that really appealed to me and that I've been passionate about that I've been successful.
This just hit me as I listen to you speak. You seem to have an opinion or a view of the world that's informed kind of by your closeness to this history and your study and love of it. How would you say that your, for lack of a better word, maybe kinship to this ancient Roman theology has informed your view of the world, the modern world?
Oh, greatly, greatly. When I was younger, my dad used to say this phrase, history is the teacher of life. And it's one of those strange things your parents say that you kind of get annoyed at because they repeat it on occasion. And then eventually when you're an adult, you kind of had a eureka moment where you're like, yeah, I get what that means. It really does. And it struck me at very difficult moments of my life where the strength I've had to go on or to overcome any difficulties that I've faced have usually come from the past, where I've thought, when you read about the great adventures that people had, the great adversities that people faced, and faced it with courage and overcame them, you think to yourself, gosh, I can do anything. And that's really the point of why these movies are so great, because they tell us these stories in which there's overwhelming odds and the hero comes out and you walk away from that movie thinking, that's who I should be like. But also I think that there's a certain universal aspect of human nature, which is that human nature doesn't change. So when you're reading something that's 2,000 years old, we really shouldn't have anything in common with it. We shouldn't understand it. But we have much in common with these people because at the end of the day, you're talking about people. And man is a beast who has certain desires. Those desires never finish. They never change. And so when you look at the world through that prism, you understand there's a certain theater to it. And there's a great wisdom that the ancients who passed everything that we've gone through many times and many years before us, it just takes to pick up a book called The Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. And Marcus Aurelius says that life is a stage, the play is the same, the only thing that changes are the actors. And so when you see that rhythm to it, you understand what's happening in the modern world, but you also have a very, I would say, a very different, you view the world in a very different prism.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that offers you peace in the chaos, to know that it's just somewhat of a cyclical cycle or something to that effect?
I don't think it gives me peace. I think, probably the last moment I can think of was COVID, where, the world is kind of, it was easy to get sort of caught in the mass hysteria and the sort of end of the world and the doomsdaying. And then you kind of sit back and you think, if I exist, it's because people have gone through thousands of years of hardships and difficulties just like this one. And so the fact that we are in existence means that we have the capability to survive and go forward. And there's a certain comfort, certainly, from saying, people have overcome every single adversity that we've ever faced in our lives, be it the simple things from breakups to the big things like health problems. Everybody in life has gone through something. And I always say that history is the story of people's lives. And you'll never read about anyone whose life went the way they thought it would. No one, none of the greats, Caesar, Spartacus, all these names that ring eternal. None of their lives turned out the way they thought they would. And there's a certain comfort in that as well.
Mm-hmm. So to get to gladiatorial combat and the events and the things kind of around this, I think there's this misconception, and as I kind of dive into learning more about it, it becomes more and more apparent that gladiatorial combat seemed to be more of a theater than a blood sport or some sort of, ritualistic killing that everyone's just there for. Can you kind of talk to me about that misconception of what it really was versus what kind of the mainstream has painted it to be?
Sure. Just before I do, I wanted to actually, sorry, just one last thought. We're talking about how it affects your life. You've heard of Spartacus, haven't you?
Yes. Yeah.
Right. It's a very famous story. I don't know if you ever watched the show.
Mm-hmm.
It's a true revolt. You know how many years that is?
No.
Like that whole thing, how long?
How long?
It's 3 years.
Oh my.
So you imagine that 3 years of a man's life, which is all we know about him, is enough to last 2,000 years.
Wow.
We live in a time when we think we have all the time in the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
You look at people whose lives, like even Caesar, what he did that made him to greatness, that made him to real greatness, 5 years of his life.
Wow.
So when you think that those years can count, that really puts a fire under your arse to do as much as you can.
Yeah.
Now,
Wow.
regarding Gladiators, you're absolutely right. It isn't what we've been led to believe, but led to believe not in a sort of nefarious way. It's just kind of naturally happened that people have interpreted that gladiators were, maybe because it tells a good story, they were meat to be ground for consumption. They were just cannon fodder that was thrown in, and they hacked limbs of each other in front of these Romans who were so barbaric that they ate and drank.
Mm-hmm.
When you walk through Rome, when you read the Roman philosophers, and you understand just the level of culture and illumination these people had, it kind of juxtaposed to these people that we've been told about were eating and drinking while people are hacking their limbs off. You think it doesn't make sense. And then you look at the modern world and you say, well, hang a second. I sit in front of my TV screen and I watch people getting hacked to bits and shooting each other. And I eat and I drink while I do it. So what does that make me? And then you realize that really at the core of it, again, it's human nature. The chance to go to the Colosseum was that chance to leave your life behind for a couple of hours. And it's the same concept of when we go to see a football game, or when we sit in front of the couch and we watch a movie, it was a chance to escape. We know when we watch television that it's not real. When people sat in the Colosseum, there was a sense of a lack of reality there, because the Colosseum was a theater. It was a cinema. It was a stadium, but rolled into one. And gladiators really were peak athletes. And I would equate it to a mix between MMA, American wrestling, and jousting. Because it's basically MMA fighters with the same sort of pageantry you get in WWE, but with weapons. I mean, how cool does that sound?
Yeah, like it sounds amazing.
If Dana White was to launch the weapons UFC, people would go and see it. We're not that different. Our fastest growing sport in the world is two guys in an octagon who in front of thousands of people beat the crap out of each other.
Yeah, that's true.
So how civilized are we more than people 2,000 years ago that we enjoy the exact same thing? Because at the heart of it, gladiators represented this great philosophy called virtus. And I'm obsessed with virtus. In fact, I would like to spend my later life teaching, especially young guys, young boys, about virtus, because it is a philosophy that the Romans perpetuated, which was they believed in physical and mental endurance, the ability to overcome anything that life throws at you. And I don't feel we quite give young men that sort of training. We have our fathers, but we're kind of thrown out into the world in a way, and that's the sort of trial and error of becoming a man, is to overcome your difficulties. But virtus is a belief in that what makes you strong, what makes you a man, is the ability to overcome. And the gladiator represented that, because they were physical exceptions. They were courageous. They didn't fight to the death, but they accepted that if death came, they would take it. Because at the end of the day, just like when you're an MMA fighter or a boxer, you could have life-changing, life-altering, life-ending injuries. You might walk in the octagon, break your neck, break your leg. I mean, you see in the UFC, people get horrendous fights. But it's the same with what you do, firefighters. You are a representation of virtus. You don't go to die, but you know that death is there. And yet you put it to the back of your mind because you have mental strength and physical strength that will enable you to overcome that moment if you need to. And the first Gladiator movie, and even the second, is all about virtus. That's what it's about. It's about a guy who's lost everything. His family's been murdered. He's been betrayed. He's been wounded. He's been sold into slavery. He's thrown into an arena, but he will still fight. And he will not stop until he's done. That's virtus.
And when you think of that, conceptually, of what they were trying to perpetuate through that, what were those teachings like? What were they trying to instill in these young people to have that be fruitful in their life? Is that a tangible set of principles, or is it more ethereal than that?
No, it's a tangible set of principles. It's basically what it is. It's a preparation for life. I mean, the gladiator represents life. The Romans were very, very intellectual, and they had a level of psychology, which, of course, psychology didn't exist, but they had that natural psychology, which was that the amphitheater was a stage. It's life, and in life, you may find yourself in a fight, whether you choose to or not, because some gladiators chose to fight, some didn't. And ultimately, the whole time, the emperor might condemn you to death, which is a very, very, very rare event. But that's life, because you have to battle. You're in the battlefield, and above you, there's someone who's going to decide your fate. And that someone can be health, bad luck, economic misfortune. There's someone who will judge you, but you have to have the courage to go forward. And life is a battle, and you're thrown things that you have to be able to overcome. And if you don't have them, you will sink to the ground. So that's really what it was. It was a way of preparing at a time when the world was far more brutal than today. I think we're so lucky to live in this period of history, because most of history doesn't look like how we live. Like, we're a blip, and the Romans are kind of before us, because when you look at the civilization and the level of civilization they're living, 2,000 years ago, man, they were ahead of their time. You look at parts of the world and the way they lived, there's no comparison. The Romans have music, poetry, stadiums, sewage systems, tax systems, lawyers, laws. They've got these incredible things that we have sort of pertained, looking back to and saying that's how we should live. And we've constructed society, this amazing society that we've created, this amazing world we've created, because of those principles 2,000 years ago, because of that philosophy.
Did when you say that, about the quality of life that the Romans were living in and how cultured it was, did the average Roman person understand that their experience was different than most of the rest of the world at that time?
Oh yeah, well, it had to. Imagine. I think people's attitudes to Rome really said a lot, and no wonder. I'm half British, so when I look at Britain before Rome conquered it, I mean, my goodness, I think what it must have been like. There's a great line actually in Gladiator, seeing as we mentioned it, where he says, "I did not think men could build such things," as when they see the Colosseum for the first time. And you have to imagine that coming from a village of thatched huts, that you came to a place that had the Colosseum, that had 50-meter tall colossal statues. There's a myth that, and it's one of these historical myths, who knows if it's true or not, that the barbarians believed that the Romans didn't actually make Rome, that giants had made them, and these little Romans, because the Romans weren't particularly tall people, had come and killed them and taken over their city, because, again, these guys are building skyscraping buildings. They're building things 50, 60, 80 meters tall, 85 meters tall. Wow. 2,000 years ago. And you look at Britain, and we're living in thatched huts. So yeah, there must have been a very obvious distinction, which is why that great line, Gladiator, again, Rome is the light. I think Rome really was the light.
So I listened to another podcast that you did, and you did something in that podcast that I want to try to replicate here, because it was like goosebumps, right? You took and painted a picture of what it would be like to go. And you talked about what the people in the stands would expect to experience, and then what they did experience. And like listening to that podcast, it was like I literally had goosebumps. Like, oh my gosh, I wish I could be there. So can you take me through that? I'm a Roman citizen. I got my ticket. I'm sitting in the stands. Open the show. What do I see?
Well, the first thing you have to know is that we live in a period where we can understand what this experience is like, because 200 years ago, baseball in America and cricket in England became so popular that they said, well, we need to build things. And they didn't have any stadiums. Nobody had built a stadium since the Colosseum. 1,800 years passed before anyone rebuilt something the size of the Colosseum. The Colosseum held between 55 to 85,000 people. So about 600 years ago, anyone who visited the Colosseum wouldn't have a concept of what it was like. Now, we're lucky because we live in what I believe is the second version of Rome. You can go anywhere in the world and you can go to a stadium of 50 to 80,000 people. So the first thing we know is the noise when we arrive to the stadium. That just constant noise that'll be there the entire time. The excitement, the buildup. You went there, you had a ticket in your hand. So imagine that 2,000 years ago, they had a gated, ticketed system. Still today, if you look above the Colosseum, you can see the numerical system so that you knew your coin had a number that corresponded to the gate. So whether you're coming from abroad, you maybe didn't even speak Latin, you could go to the Gladiator games, just as we do when we go to away games, right? I might go see a World Cup game in Germany. I don't speak German. I don't need to because the coin or my ticket has the number. So as soon as you arrived, there was stalls outside selling food, souvenirs. So you could buy lamps, you could buy statues of gladiators, you could buy flags. And as you walked in, that great thing of going through the ticket stand, going up the stairs, and when you come out the stairs that lead you into the stadium, that noise that hits you, 55 to 85,000 people cheering at the same time. It's like a wave, a tidal wave. It would have been the exact same. As you sat down, you got your seat, music was playing, an announcer would tell you why you were there, and then a parade called the Pompa would happen. So as music was playing, out of the tunnels came the wild animals, the beast hunters, the criminals, and then the gladiators. So they'd go out. Think of when wrestling comes on, music's playing, you know from the soundtrack, I know which guy's coming out now. And out they would come and they'd call the name. And as the gladiator walked out and the people erupted, there was someone holding a stick with stats on the back of him. So it told you, this guy, you're the people's champion, the bone crusher, 30 fights, 20 wins, 10 losses. So it had the stats already.
Wow.
Then the whole time underneath, what you didn't see is that there was 2 levels of underground trapdoors, lifts, pulleys. It was a full theater. And as they were doing the parade, they were actually sticking trees on the lifts. So that at a certain point, you imagine you're sitting there looking at sand and trees would start to pop out of the ground one at a time, transforming the arena into a jungle. A trapdoor would fall, out would run a tiger. Another trapdoor, another tiger. And then out of a trapdoor in the middle, your hunter with his spear. So 2,000 years ago, you're sitting with a full soundtrack of music playing, and you're watching a hunter going through a forest in the jungles of India, which you will never visit because they're 3 months travel, but you don't need to because you're looking at it right now, hunting a tiger. And of course, as he's getting closer to the tiger, you can see that he can stalk him because he's a professional hunter. The music starts building. As he gets closer, the music builds. And then as he starts fighting him and he's stabbing him, the music builds. Eventually, he stabs the tiger. He stabs the other one behind him. The music blows up. The crowd goes mad. And the trees pop back down into the ground. Sand. And it was time for the halftime show.
Wow.
Music, acrobats, dancers, musicians, fire breathers. And best of all, there is a raffle. So basically they'll go around, they'll throw coins into the stall and you catch the coin. And later on, they'll say number 76. You'll be like, oh, that's me. And you can win stuff. So you can win a horse, you can win land, you can win food. Then they would execute the criminals, public executions. And then as the sun started to go down a little bit, so around about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the gladiators would start. And just like when you go to an MMA fight or a boxing match, it starts with the lesser known guys and it builds up to the title fight. The trilogy you've been waiting for. Mike Tyson versus Jake Paul, Tyson Fury versus Usyk, whoever, Conor McGregor versus Dustin Poirier. That's the fight you've come to see. And then at the end of it, you left and you went back to your life. But for that amount of time you were there, you forgot your job, you forgot your taxes, you forgot your kids, you forgot you got to take your kids to school and your wife's asked you to do something. For that brief moment, your life is your champion gladiator. The same as when you go to the Super Bowl for a brief period, your life is a champion quarterback scoring the winning touchdown, the final seconds, that euphoria or that loss, and you leave the stadium and you go back to your life.
Wow. From like I have a couple of like logistical questions. Like, how long were these events? How often were they held? How much did they cost? Like, was this like a massive burden to the people of Rome to like be able to afford to go, or was it kind of accessible?
It was no different than a Super Bowl. It was very expensive to put on, but not everyone can put a Super Bowl on, right? So the NFL exclusively does that. While in ancient Rome, the emperor exclusively done that because, again, the levels of psychology to the games. Why is the emperor doing this? Because ultimately, here's a guy who says, hey, listen, I'm going to give you free tickets to Super Bowl. You got an open bar. There's a buffet all day. You can win stuff. You've got the greatest show on earth. All you have to do is just love me. Don't worry about government, or don't worry about the plague, and don't worry about that we might be invaded by barbarians. You come to the games. You watch your fantasy gladiator league, and you watch the games, and we take care of the rest.
Wow.
And that's kind of what the NFL does, except the NFL doesn't, or any sports event doesn't sell you power. It sells you a product. So I'm going to put on this great show. There's a halftime show. There's the greatest sports stars of their time. They're going to think, and what do I do in exchange? I say to you, buy this product. But that's how's the NFL make that money? They make it through advertising. How does the emperor pay for the games? Advertising. So if you ever go visit the Colosseum in Rome, along the edge of the arena, there's a white strip of marble. It has names on it. That's the people who sponsor the games.
Oh.
So around the edge of the arena, just like when you watch any sport today, there's the name of the sponsor. Because otherwise the emperor has to get the money from the taxes, which means you're going to pay for the games. And he can't have that.
Wow. So you briefly touched on the executions. Like how, like there's this classic narrative that at least I've always felt or heard of, like, you know, just executing the Christians. Everyone was happy about it. Whatever the thing is, it's just like, was this a part of the games that people look forward to? Is this kind of a thing that the emperor had to do to kind of exert his power in that moment, or something?
No, you got to look at it more basic than that. Is that, you know, again, it's very easy to get people's attention in modern times. I mean, look, you know, we carry devices where if people want our attention, they can get it. You didn't have that back then. So you had to create an arena or a stage upon which people would actually come to visit you. So if you said, listen, I need to tell you something, I'm your ruler, some people might show up. If you say, well, look, I'm going to give you a free drink. Okay, I might be there. How about a free buffet? How about a game? How about a halftime show? How about, and then all of a sudden you're like, yeah, this is the show I cannot miss. But ultimately for the emperor, he's doing it because now he has an audience. He has 85,000 people sitting there. And here's my message. I'm the ruler. I'm in charge. And if you cross me, this is what happens. So now that I have your attention, here's a guy who's killed and raped people. He's going to be fed to a bear. It's not entertainment. It's awful. Nobody can, nobody, however cruel. I mean, there must, you know, I'm sure there's some people, but majoritively people aren't that cruel enough to look at that and go, oh, that's exciting. You're like, oh, that's awful. And you're like, I don't want to end up like that guy.
Yeah.
It's basically, you know, public executions exist today in the world. They've existed throughout history, and they will always exist because you need to set an example. I mean, look how tough it is to cohesively keep society together with the laws and the law enforcement we have. We have strict laws. We have people to enforce them. People still break laws. Imagine 2,000 years ago. You want to rape, you want to kill, you will be fed to a bear in front of everybody. You will be humiliated and destroyed. So it's not entertainment. It's just human psychology. Again, it's teaching a lesson. You want to fight against Rome, then we will capture you and we will make you fight each other to the death in front of a crowd. That's how humiliating it is. But that's the power of Rome. So you have to respect the laws. Well, that's what happens. But they don't have anything to do with gladiators. They get kind of muddled into the whole talk, which is why gladiators, when I was a little boy, I was told gladiators fought animals and they killed each other and they killed Christians. You're like, oh my gosh. But no, that's not true.
So there's also this thing that I know a little bit about, but I want you to break down, which is this kind of strange, dichotomy of the gladiators where they were both kind of revered and reviled in society, and they both were the top and the bottom of the social food chain. How did that work, and how does that work?
Well, they're just like reality stars. My wife enjoys greatly watching a huge plethora of horrendous reality TV show, which is about people, who have generally are reviled and loved at the same time. Mm-hmm. Just the reality stars of that period. They are the obsession. They're the celebrities of their period. We have a similar attitude, I think, towards celebrities. We kind of, we worship them and admire them, but we also revile them. We don't think they're terribly smart sometimes. Generally, they're not. I mean, same as sports stars. We don't see them as, intellectual beacons. They're physical. They're beastly, aren't they? They're more animal because they're about physicality, not about intellect. Mm-hmm. So it's the same thing. The gladiators were celebrities. They were the most famous people. They were sexually desired, but it came with the fact that what were they doing? They were entertaining. Well, that's a bit trashy. Mm-hmm. They're not saving the world, They're not feeding the hungry. They're not curing famine. But
yeah. Can you talk through this misconception also of the fact that these gladiators were slaves or concubines to the system, but in fact it would appear that they were more generally free men who lived well outside of the games. Is that correct?
They were a mixture. So of course slavery did exist, and some gladiators were slaves and some were free men, because there was a lot of money involved in it and a lot of prestige. Again, I would say put it in MMA fighters, you get the sort of dichotomy of people who are immensely poor to middle class to some people who are actually come from wealthy families, want to be MMA fighters. Why? Because there's a prestige around it. But you also have to look at the period historically. People didn't have a lot of opportunity. I mean, even today, I think, most famously, our big sports stars come from abject poverty and they kind of pull themselves out through sport. And the Romans kind of gave this golden opportunity because most of human history, playing sport has not been lucrative. So we live in a period where it is. People can become billionaires. They can change a social and economic class that has not been able to be changed throughout history through sport. You look back through time, the Romans are the first to give that opportunity to really change your economic status through sport. So people were drawn to the arena, but it's also the notion that you were a slave in a way because you were bound contractually to your trainer. I'd equate it to being in the army, for example. You can't join the army and then after a certain period decide you just want to leave because you don't like it. You are pretty much bound. So there is a level of bondage. So in that case, if you look at it that way, when you became a gladiator, whether the free man or slave, you were bound to your trainer. Your trainer is going to mold you into something.
So with that, if you are a valuable asset, I would imagine these stars are very valuable assets to the, not only the Roman Empire in terms of entertainment, but also these individual trainers. If we went into the games hoping that no one's going to die and someone does die, did that ever have massive ramifications? Or what was if my fighter goes in and your fighter goes in and your guy kills mine because your guy's an idiot or whatever the thing is, what was the fallout from that? I would have to imagine there would be consequences or something.
Yeah. Oh, and sorry, one last thing. Again, about the period of history, there was abject poverty. So what were your opportunities to actually become something? You could join the army, which is 16 to 25 years of your life. And again, you might die, more than likely you're a soldier, or you can join the arena. But there was a risk. Of course, there was a risk because you are fighting with weapons. I mean, you've got huge helmets, you're padded, you're very well trained. There's a lot of, I would say, choreography that went into the fighting. But ultimately, you are fighting with weapons, and so people did get injuries. And we know this because we found a gladiator cemetery in Turkey, and through the bones, we actually see wounds. But what we see is that they've been medically treated. So you had an on-site doctor in the actual gladiator school, and modern medicine, by the way, that we have today, is because of a gladiator doctor called Galen of Pergamum. He was a gladiator doctor in Aluda, so he got a job. One of the big jobs he got was working in a gladiator school. So he got to understand wounds and sutures, and modern medicine is about 300 years ago. We rediscovered his works from the time of Marcus Aurelius, so 1,800 years ago. Wow. And that's where that's how modern medicine is that 300 years ago we picked up where the Romans were almost 2,000 years ago. So that's the level of care they were getting. So they were very well looked after. But yeah, if you died, what happened? Well, people die in the ring. I don't know if you follow MMA. Yeah. Conor McGregor, when he broke his leg, what happened? I mean, as a fan, you're crushed. You're like, oh, the guy's never going to fight again. So, of course, it had ramifications in that aspect, but it also had ramifications for your trainer, for the guys who fed you, who built your following, which is what people do today. These guys, and that's why they went out of their way not to kill them. You wanted to avoid that because we actually have laws about if you damage a gladiator while he's being rented out to you, basically, it has financial ramifications because I have a contract with the gladiator. So gladiators sign contracts. And if in that 3 years I'm going to make $1 million, you have to give me that $1 million back because you've put me out of business.
Interesting. It's
it's a good topic, right?
No, it is. It's fascinating.
You think gladiators are just prize fighters, and then you're like, no, there's so many layers to it that it's like a sinkhole, there's a rabbit hole. The more you go into it, you're like, man, there's just so many different layers to it.
So if these events, how often were these events held roughly?
We don't know because we don't have, the funny thing is the sources are very lapse on certain things, It's funny, a lot of the stuff that we take for granted, again, a lot of the stuff that I believed about gladiators, when you read it, you're like, wait, that's where it comes from? Like, like thumbs up or thumbs down, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a mention of a thumb being pressed and a thumb being turned, but it doesn't tell you what that means. What is a turned thumb? What's a pressed thumb? Like, is that what's pressing my thumb? And I was like, but wait a second, why have I always, like, if you say to someone gladiator, they'll go,
yeah, of course.
Yeah, that's movies.
Interesting.
Those who are about to die salute you, they never said it. Actually, it was a group of criminals who were being facetious to an emperor because the emperor was going to make them fight on ships. But they were criminals. They were not gladiators. They weren't given any training. And so they were being really facetious to the emperor, saying, well, we who are about to die, thanks very much. Salute you, great emperor. And he thought it was so funny that he laughed. He said, well, maybe not. And they said, oh, you've pardoned us. We're not going to fight. And so the emperor had to go down and convince them to fight, or he was going to like excruciatingly crucify them or do something to them. But because it sounds good, we associate it with gladiators. So that comes, the sources sometimes are very patchy. We don't know how often the fights were because it took a lot to make the fights. There probably would have been a season, like a football season, and there would have been sort of special events. But I would say at least once a month, if not more.
Oh, wow. Okay. So that's more than I have anticipated. But like you said, there wasn't like, we have the NFL or pick the sport, and then you have subsidiary leagues that you work through to get there. It wasn't like that, right? You went to the Colosseum and you did it, and you didn't do it elsewhere. Is that right or no?
Well, also remember, it's a sport that's 700 years old. I think American football is about 150 years old. MMA is 30. Really, when you look at the UFC, it's 30 years old. So it's a sport that had a long life. It had a great longevity to it. So in different periods of that history, it would have been different. There would have been emperors who put on games more frequently, some who didn't. The Emperor Augustus, who was the first Roman emperor, he put them on with a certain frequency. The Emperor Tiberius, who succeeded him, didn't like the games, thought they were a waste of money, didn't put them on that much. So again, it depends on the period of history. But the one thing that's a constant is that the emperor is the only one allowed to put the games on. So there were leagues. There was like a league. There was lesser leagues. So you might go to like North Africa. We know there's stadiums there. And what we know is that maybe a gladiator, once he's kind of had his heyday in Rome, which is the big time, he'll go play in the lesser leagues. You see that a lot in soccer, for example. You know, you get guys from Europe, they go play in like Dubai, or they go play maybe for Miami, or, you know.
Yeah, just as a spectacle from their name.
Well, yeah, because the name has a draw, and that's always been a constant. So great gladiators, for example, which you see in the Gladiator movie, they bring out the undefeated champion and everyone goes crazy. Yeah, that existed. We see it in modern times, right? In the sense that Mike Tyson's going to fight Jake Paul. You're like, Mike Tyson? Iron Mike? Man, I'm going to see that. And you're like, wait, he hasn't fought in how many years? Isn't the guy 60? You're like, no, he's Mike Tyson. You know, so that draw, we see that still today. Gladiators had the same draw. If you were the guy who won the major tournament in the Colosseum on the emperor's birthday, you were known throughout 60 million people. You were known throughout the Roman Empire. We're talking about a place that stretches from the north of Africa to the north of Scotland. Sorry, to the north of England and Scotland. So people knew you because the news spread. And, you know, you get lamps and you get souvenirs. So you might be in England or Scotland and you have a souvenir of a Colosseum fight of two gladiators with their names on it. And you're like, man, that was, you know, it's like a trading card or something.
Yeah. So if it had longevity like that many years, how and why did it end?
Well, it ended for a couple of reasons. And I always say they're the same reasons that changed the world, which is religion, economy, and politics. That's what changes the world, you know, money, religion, and politics. And that's what affected the gladiator phenomenon. The first is money. It became so expensive to put on these games. And because the emperor's paying for the games to make himself popular, it's advertising. The emperor that we most associate with gladiators because of the movie Gladiator, Marcus Aurelius, took the money out of the sport. So he put a cap on how much players could earn, how much you could charge. When the money's out of the sport, there's no point. And I think you've seen that with baseball, where the money's kind of gone out of baseball because they're not making as much anymore. It's not prestigious. So if I'm an athlete, do I want to be a baseball star or do I want to be a footballer? Yeah, I might go be a footballer. There's more money. So that's what happened. The money got taken out of it. So it starts to lose its appeal. Religion played a part, which was Christianity became prevalent. But it's a misconception that Christians were somehow obsessed with, poor gladiators, because they're not poor gladiators. The Christians believed that it had an effect on the people who watched the games. The obsession with Christianity in the sport was not on the sands. It was in the arena. It was in the stadium itself. It was amongst the spectators. So we have Christian writers who talk about people going to the games and they become drunk on fury and anger. And it's understandable. I mean, you see a UFC crowd, a boxing crowd. When guys get there and there's testosterone and there's, you know, people beating the crap out of each other, it does have an effect on you, of course. So the Christians thought that was a bad thing. You can't disagree with that. And the last thing is politics, which is that Rome, the world changed politically. The Roman Empire was coming to an end. And the point of putting on the games was to win the crowd, was to make yourself popular. But Rome's popularity lost because the capital of Rome, of the Roman Empire, went to Constantinople, to Turkey. So the Roman public, who the Roman emperors had lavished all these games on to make them happy, weren't worth anything anymore. And so it just died out as a sport. And I mean, again, hey, it lasted 700 years. Who knows if American football will be around in another, 500
Certainly, yeah.
Yeah, right.
I have one really stupid question, but I don't think I'll ever have the opportunity to ask someone that might actually know the answer. So when I think about you watch a scene from Gladiator and you see, the emperor talk to the crowd. This feels impossible to me, right? I can't imagine trying to address an 80,000 person arena without a microphone. How on earth? I'm sure they came up with some ingenious system to do this.
They did, but we don't know it. We've got one image of a herald who appears to be a herald. He's interpreted as a herald. There is a mention of a herald. So what we can surmise is that, first of all, one of the big people who was communicating with the spectators was the referee. So there was 2 referees in a gladiator fight, which again shows you that there's rules. It's not a free-for-all. One guy's on the sidelines, one in the middle, which I absolutely love, because again, it shows you that when you strip away society and you look at any period of history, people repeat themselves. So even today, you've got 2 referees. One's on the sideline, one's in the middle. He's the guy who breaks up the fight. He would have communicated with the crowd, and he would have said, a deduction of 1 point, a legal move, this side, break. And if you look at how NFL referees communicate with the crowd, they're kind of ridiculous, like a field goal and, all these hand gestures, because once upon a time, there weren't tannoy systems, there weren't speaker systems. So how did you communicate with the crowd? Well, you did it physically, and you more than likely had people in different parts who would have given the message over and over again.
So like a repeater system, right? Some form of that. Interesting.
Yeah. Well, you have to think, well, how did you know, I don't know, in the 30s or the 20s, even in the end of the 1800s, how did you know what was going on when you're in a stadium of 20,000 people, 30,000 people? So there had to be a system. The Romans would have had something similar.
Wow. Well, I don't want to keep you all day. I literally could talk to you for the next 18 hours. But I really do appreciate your time coming and painting the picture, giving us a real view of what gladiators' life were like. And like, I have to cut myself off because I just will go for 7 hours.
We haven't spoken about Gladiator yet, the movies.
Oh, I suppose that's true.